Everybody. Okay, Rob, we ready? We're recording.
Yeah,
You want to follow?
I'm going to backtrack a little bit, not too much, but a backtrack a little bit. Okay.
The translates is the rabbi. You translate.
Okay.
We're here.
I'm going to start from the top there.
Okay.
Okay.
Rabbi.
The discussion continues about unkosher fish. The halachic status of fish, which fish are kosher, which fish are not kosher. That's the subject matter of the Gemora over here. We also went through various different types of fish, and also the concept that the simonim of fish are fins and scales, snapir v'kaskeses, and we said that it doesn't matter if the fins and scales are barely visible as long as they're there. And in fact, that's a very interesting thing, because sometimes people would say that something that you can't see with a naked eye is not a problem, or is a problem. In other words, you define things by what you can see. If the human eye can't tell that there's scales, maybe the scales that come about after scientific effort under a microscope don't count. But what we're learning here is that they do. It doesn't matter how they are to be found. If they're there, they're there. And it doesn't matter if they're there only in the water and not when the fish comes out the water. And that comes out very strongly from the different examples
at the door,
that we have over here. So yeah, let's just go back a few lines. The people in art school, have you got the place? We're going from Omar Abaya Haichamra the Yama, the sea donkey. Abaya, can you see where that is? Abaya said the sea donkey. Are you okay there, Benji? Otherwise I can find it for you.
39A. In sea donkey. 39A.
I'll bring my glasses. Yeah. Haichamra the Yama. It's right here.
Okay, thank you.
Abaya talks about a particular aquatic creature or fish that's called a sea donkey. Amar Abaya said, Haichamra the Yama, this donkey of the sea. Shara is permissible. He identifies it as a kosher fish. And we don't really know, I said last week, exactly what that is, because the Mefarshim, the commentaries on the Gemora, not able to identify precisely what it is, except that it sounds like it's somebody from the cod family. In fact, in modern Hebrew, the type of fish that's called a sea donkey is one of the fish from the cod family. Hura de Yama, another fish called an ox of the sea, asir, is prohibited. V'simonech, and Abaya said, your way to remember this, tomei, tohir, tohir, tomei. The unclean one's clean and the clean one is unclean. In other words, the fish that has tomei, that has the name of an unclean animal on the surface, on the shore, is a clean animal in the water. And the one that has the name of a clean animal, which is an ox or a pure animal, is actually tamei, is the impure animal. So that's just an easy little piece. Whatever it is that the sea donkey is, the tradition is that Abaya says it's okay. And whatever the sea ox is, Abaya says it's not okay. Would help if we knew precisely what fish these are. Then Rav Ashi comes and talks about a fish called a shvar. Nuna is the Aramaic for fish. So there's something called a shvar fish, and there's something called a kvar fish. Sounds almost like farfel. A shvar fish, which is shvar nuna, a kvar nuna, and there's another one called a kaddish nuna. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ashi says the fish called shvar nuna is shara, is okay. Now you can see the wording. If nuna is a fish, it's like a shvar fish. The fish called a shvar fish is okay. There will be a bit more about this particular fish further down the page. in a more anecdotal sense. Kadash nuna asir, or Kaddish nuna is prohibited. V'semonaich, and how do you know? What's your sign to remember this? Your mnemonic, your trick, Shmois Tezayin Chav Gimel, is that it says Kodesh Lashem. It talks about certain things as being holy to God. The word Kadash is almost like Kodesh. So Kodesh Lashem, holy to God, would be with reference to something that's separated. It's holy to God, but it's not for me and you. We can't eat it. It's a memory game. It's just showing you how you can find a way to remember which ones are good and which ones aren't. Ika the Amra, some people say, Kfar Nuna Asur, that a third kind called the Kfar Nuna, which almost has the word grave in it, kever sounds like a grave, is prohibited or not kosher. V'semanaich, and your sign to remember this is kivra ovdei kichavim, the impure graves of Gentiles. So therefore, think about impure graves. And it's an interesting concept because the funny thing is in Tumah V'Tara, when it comes to Kohanim, the graves of the Gentiles are actually not impure.
Now they're doing about the kosher animals.
Okay, where are we?
Rabbi,
I'm just going to mute.
the Kirakan therefore go close to a Gentile grave. They can't go
So
close to
technically, yes, because it's a different kind of impurity. But the reason why they don't is because we don't always really know who's who. You can have someone you think is a Gentile and they really aren't, or you could think it's a Gentile grave and it really isn't. So Lamaise, in other words, in actuality, Kohanim are careful with all graves. But certain forms of Tumah V'Tara, of spiritual purity and spiritual impurity, don't necessarily apply if it's a non-Jew.
It applies with non-kosher foods.
Sorry?
It applies with non-kosher foods.
What applies with non-kosher foods?
You can't touch creepy crawly
Because it's not considered. I hear what you're saying. Besides for not being kosher, it's also spiritually impure. You'd have to go and cleanse after touching it. Asheret says it's called. Shratzim, yeah. Then the Gemora tells us a story. Rabbi Akiva Ikla Ginzak. Rabbi Akiva went to a place called Ginzak. Isa Lakamei Haununa. They brought in front of Rabbi Akiva a particular fish. They have a dama lechipusha, which looked a lot like another eel called a chipusha. Oh, sorry, the eel's coming later. Maybe I'm jumping the gun. It looked like a chipusha, which was a non-kosher fish. So they bring him a fish and they put it in front of him. Is the fish kosher? Is the fish not kosher? The only thing we know is he's got a cousin that isn't kosher. You know, you often the Gemara is doing a lot of comparatives here. This species looks a bit like that species, like we said, I think last week, all the time before, that you can have a fish like a tuna, that some of them are kosher and some aren't kosher, but they're all tunas. So the chipush is not kosher, and they bring a fish in front of Rabbi Akiva, an unnamed fish that looks like the chipusha. What did he do? Chafya badikula. He closed it in a basket, and once it was closed in a basket, chaza by kalfa, he saw scales, Basharia, and he permitted it. He said, this is a kosher fish. And there's an argument there. Rashi says that what happened was, because it was locked in the basket, it went under stress, it started to squirm, and the squirming caused the scales to come off. That's how they saw them. Rabbeinu Chananel, these are different commentators on the Gemara, says that he actually did a test, that he was rubbing the side of the fish against the side of the utensil, and then these little scales arrived. So you couldn't see them easily, but once you had control of the fish, it wasn't out there, and you could manipulate and play with it a bit, you could start to see scales. So even though it looked like the chipusha, which wasn't kosher, in this confined vessel, it clearly had scales that peeled off it, and therefore he permitted it. Another story of a great rabbi that had to rule on a fish, Rav Ashi Ikla Tamduria. Rav Ashi came to a place called Tamduria. Aisul Kamei Haununa, they brought a fish in front of him to have a domal at slufcha that looked like an eel. It wasn't an eel, but it looked like an eel. Noktel had a yoima. He took it out against the daylight. Chaza, and he was able to see the Hava Beit Simcha, that it did have these kinds of thin scales on it, v'shar yeh, and he permitted it. So again, it's a type of fish that initially people might have thought didn't have scales. It wasn't obvious, but when he took it out and looked at it carefully in the lights of the day, it had these very thin scales and he permitted it. What we're seeing from all of this is it doesn't matter how small. It doesn't matter how hard. It doesn't matter how long they stay. If they're there, they're there. If they're for sure there, they're there.
Was there such a suffix with the kingdom nowadays?
So I don't know, we'd have to ask the mumchim, because if it's very clear that it has scales, then there should be no suffix. Especially, and you know, the funny thing is with this kind of thing, science should be on our side, because now that you have a microscope, halacha is not saying a microscope doesn't help. You have to see it with your eyes. There are certain areas in halacha that it's to do with what the eye sees, not with, like, take for instance, when it comes to the little thingamajigs, what do you call it, bugs and that. Some people will say that if the naked eye can't see the thing, if you need a microscope to find it, then that's not a problem. We don't expect people to prepare salad in a lab with a microscope. So there are certain areas where it's to do with what the human eye can actually perceive in a fair and reasonable check. But here what we're finding out about fish, that because the Torah used that word b'mayim, the Torah said it has to have snapir v'kaskeses. When it's in the water, it would appear that even if you need some technology to figure out that it's got scales, that's good enough, as long as it's for sure. So coming back to your question, if it's for sure that it's got scales, the big question is, what would the problem be? Why would anybody worry about it? Maybe there are other issues. I'm just suggesting we'd have to ask one of the experts in kashrus. Look, the broad-based decision of the Beis Din is to accept it. But I think your question would be, what's the havamin of the people that don't accept it? You know, what is their reasoning? Maybe, yeah. No, but maybe there's another reason. Maybe they worry that perhaps if the scales fall off, that maybe some in the species don't have. Maybe there's a very closely related type that doesn't have. And now you're worried that you pull this one out, who looks a bit like an eel, and with the experts, they managed to scrape off 2 scales, so he's okay. But it doesn't mean that his cousin is. So maybe the concept is that you are ruling out all of them because of some of them. Because I hear what you're saying. If the scales are there, they're there. It's not a. What do they say? Sorry. Other way around, it's got scales, it's got fins. I don't think fins doesn't mean scales, scales means fins. Is that the right way around?
I need some water. Take my tablet.
Just give me a few minutes.
If it's got
So if it's got scales, it's got fins.
I think the formula is
Or big.
Some.
How are you, man? Where's our chips, man? You can only come if you bring the chips. I'm just joking with you. Sorry, Aubrey, I'm just joking.
okay. I think, sorry, just to clarify, I think the concept of fins and scales, I think, is that if it has scales, it will have fins. There is no such thing as a fish that has scales and no fins. But if it has fins, it doesn't mean that for sure it's got scales. In other words, you can have a fish that has fins without scales, but you cannot have a fish that has scales without fins. Any fish with scales has fins. Therefore, the Torah could have said, instead of saying any fish that has fins and scales is kosher, theoretically the Torah could have said, if it has scales, it's kosher, because if it has scales, it will have fins. But there's many reasons for that. There's a whole...
Also, a red meat fish is always kosher.
Really, I didn't... What do you mean, like...
No, red meat, like salmon. Yeah. Because red meat is kosher.
Red ones have also got red meat.
No.
Or salt and coke.
But it still must have fins and scales.
That's red.
Okay, Rav Ashi, let's carry on reading inside. Rav Ashi ikla lahu asra. Rav Ashi came to a certain place. I saw a kama nuna. They brought a fish in front of Rav Ashi. They have a dome l'shvarnuna. Like the shvarnuna. Remember, we spoke about it a few lines higher up on the page, that Rav Ashi spoke about a fish called a shvarnuna. So here again, they say that Rav Ashi came to a certain land. They brought a fish in front of him. It looked like a shvarnuna. Chafya bimshichle chavara. Sorry?
Nuna is the general.
Nuna is general, and shvarnuna is a shvar fish. It's like saying whitefish, stockfish, hakefish. So, but sometimes fish goes into the name. Shellfish, not kosher, but sometimes the word fish is inside the name of the fish. But you're right. It looked like, nuna is the general term. So, asala kama nuna, they brought a fish in front of him to have a doma l'shvar nuna, which is similar to the fish called shvar nuna. What did he do? He closed it in a white vessel. Chazabay kalfa, and then he saw scales. This fish had very small scales. The challenge is that this fish had black scales. Now, dark black scales you won't see against the dark black background. So what he did is he put it in a white vessel, and the moment it was in a white vessel, you could see the black scales. Once he saw these dark scales, he was able to permit the fish and say, look, it's got scales. V'sharya, he permitted it. Rabbi Bar Chana ikra la'akra de agma. Somebody, sage Rabbi Bar Chana, came to a place called Akra de Agma, Krivalei Tzachanta. They brought in front of him Tzachanta. We've already said in a previous discussion in this Gemora that Tzachanta is like almost a patay dish that's made up of small fish. It sounds to me that Tzachanta would be a bit like a patay, like fish paste or snook patay. Or
bad smell.
Sorry? But this is called a tzachanta.
No, in Hebrew,
Really? Some people believe that sardines do. There's that old expression. What do they say? Hishtadol liyos b'makom she'ein ish, hishtadol liyos ish. There's that saying, and if there's no man around, be a man, be the good, righteous person. So there used to be in a haim, I think there used to be an expression, b'makom she'ein ish is a herring oicha fish. If there isn't anybody available, a herring's also a fish. So you can imagine what they thought of herring if they made that expression. So they brought tzachanta in front of Rabbi Bar Chana, which was generally a patay or a paste made from kosher fish, a small kosher fish. It would seem that most of the commentaries think that this is some kind of sardine. Somebody in the sardine family, sardines, pilchards, from the sardine run, a little guy, but we can't be 100% sure that it's exactly the same thing. But generally, tzachanta was considered kosher. However, at the time, Shamalahal Gavra to have a korele butter. He heard somebody else call it butter. You know what it's a bit like when people eat mock crayfish. Because crayfish are prepared like that. So mock crayfish is the mock version, the kosher version of crayfish. So and we call it mock crayfish. But what happened was he had this dish put in front of him. The caterer brought a platter, a dish of tzachanta, and some fellow walked by and he said, "Bate." In other words, like he identified it as something which wasn't a kosher fish. So once this person pointed to it and called it by that name, he decided, I ain't eating it. He dropped his knife and fork. Boom, not eating this. What happened? Omar, he said, me the korele bate. If somebody's calling this bate, bate was another kind of sea creature that wasn't kosher. It makes me think that there's something wrong here. You didn't eat from it. Letzafra einba, in the morning when there was more light. In those days there was load shedding. They couldn't see the fish well at night. When you go to a function,
load shedding every night.
when you go to a function and they dim the lights and you can't. So jokes aside, it wasn't as easy to examine at night. So it would seem that he didn't eat it because somebody commented, but he didn't have a chance to really look. I'm not sure what you could look at. Maybe there were skins in there or some identifying factors. Latzafra Einbar, the next morning he looked at it, Ashkech by Davar Tameh, and he saw that there was in fact something Tameh, something not kosher in that mixture. So in other words, he said, whoa, I nearly ate something I shouldn't have. Luckily, this fellow walked by and said that's Bacher. In modern language, it's almost as if he was sitting there trying to eat, I don't know, anchovy paste or some kind of pate, and some dude walks by and says, that's seafood, that's made from, I don't know, crayfish or shellfish or whatever. And then the guy backs off and says, whoops, I'm not going to... that fish. That's a pretzel fish, that's mizonot. So he decides he's not eating it. The next morning when it's light, he looks at it and he sees that he shouldn't have eaten it, that there was, in fact, something wrong.
Is this kosher?
No, that's not, I don't think so. That's a form of cod, hooray. It comes from the stingray family. But the reason that he puts that picture in this Gemora is because he's saying that some of the exotic names that we were just mentioning, that's an eel. That looks like an eel. So eel itself is not kosher, but the Gemara does mention that there's certain kosher fish that look like eels. Kingklip is probably what we know to be like that. It is kosher, but it has a bit of an eel look.
What is this actually teaching us then? Because there seems to be a bigger lesson in that than the status, kashrut status of the fish.
So I think the Gemara went into the discussion because of the fact that we were talking about foods that one's not allowed to have and trust. More than that, it also wanted to teach us that sometimes it's obvious that something's good. Sometimes you need an expert to figure it out for you. Like, for instance, these fish that they're busy pointing out over here are all like on the borderline. You know, if you go into the fish shop and you see a guy that's that typical fish shape, or like Saul was saying, red meat fish or whatever before, you know, if it looks like a salmon and you can see, you don't have to be a big expert to know that that's kosher. So you do have to be able to identify those. To this day, the halacha is, so if you want to buy fish in a place that's not a kosher fish place, like near me is that the famous one, Dunkeld. Do you know the Dunkeld fishery? It's not too far from where we are. In the Dunkeld Center. So if you want to go buy fish in those kind of places, there must be an identifying factor. You have to see the skin or something on it that tells you that that's really a red Roman or a salmon or a Cape Cobbleo or whatever it is. If they give you mince or just a fillet that's just plain flesh, that's not even red flesh. It's not good enough if you can't identify, unless you're such an expert that you can tell that that flesh is undoubtedly salmon. Sorry, yeah. But generally, you're supposed to be able to see it with the skin. Yeah, I think I did mention my one son is a bit of a chef, so he wanted tuna steaks from that place over there. But the problem is that whenever they get tuna, it looks like a roast from the butchery. They've already, it's such a big fish, and they've already chunked it. It's already just a chunk of meat, fish meat. So he managed to get them. Yeah, it's such a big thing that it's a block from the middle. It's like getting a piece from the middle of the cow, and how you going to identify that that's really big, you know? So he asked them the one time if they could bring a piece that comes from the edge of the fish, so that there's at least some skin, some tuna skin from a so-called kosher tuna with scales. And they brought him a slice, and the slice was in a bucket. It was like in a barrel, because they're so big that he managed to organize it. They brought him a full slice. So, you know, if you cut a tuna like you know, like they make fish steaks, some people actually stuff them. It was exactly that shape, but it was like that. And then you could tell that it's from, because the tuna skin was there. And then they cut him pieces off that. I mean,
so would you be able to?
Then you could have it.
Would you be able to rely on a non-Jew as an expert if you're not an expert in that in identification?
I think there must be something there. Some skin.
You have to have the skin on the one side.
Yeah, and there must be some skin available around. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. Something.
Because he's knife trafficked to cutting it up.
No, funny enough, we're about to learn that there's certain cases where the knife's a problem, but generally in the fisheries today, the knives are cold and the fish can be rinsed. Yeah.
Then it's not a
It's
concern.
been cold now.
Yeah, cold. If it's a fishery that's also a deli, if
Yeah.
they also, like, some of the fisheries have this thing that they actually serve hot fish as well. So for instance, there was one like that in Rivonia. In fact, I think Doug Fish originally opened on that kind of business model, that the concept was that you can buy raw fish, but you can also have it cooked. So there was some fisheries like that you could basically buy your fish, and then instead of taking it home to grill, they would grill exactly what you chose. So if they're doing all of that in the same place with all their ingredients, now this knife is being used in the prep in a non-kosher kitchen for hot cooking with possibly non-kosher sauces and creams and who knows what. Now it's not kosher. But if it's a fishery that's only supplying cold fish, like the typical fish counter at the back of a Pick and Pay or a Checkers or the one in Dunkeld, that knife is not a problem because it's only being used to cut cold, raw fish. And then all you have to do is, a lot of people do like to take their own knife anyway, but even if you don't, you can rinse the fish from where they cut it. You just have to give it a rinse. Sorry, so
there's material the trade now.
sorry, it's if it's just a cold fish place.
No,
Yeah.
even though they cutting.
Raw fish, they're selling raw fish, even if there's shellfish and who knows what there, but as long as everything there is raw. I don't know, but but you must be sure that they're not using it to cook and do other stuff.
Yeah.
In other words, it's purely for the
Cold
fish
meals are
counter.
fine with anything.
Yeah.
Remember, generally cold meals are fine, even breakfast. If it's a cold meal, cereal and milk. If it's
Depends
kosher
which
milk.
country you're in.
That's a different situation. Yeah.
But generally,
Yes.
I mean, I wouldn't do it now, but generally. it should
Well,
be
yeah,
fine.
you can be, if you know that the cereal's okay and you know that, so Ashbad Korea Nafsha, he read concerning himself. It says in Proverbs in Mishlei Yud Beis Chav Aleph, Lo Ye'une Ela Tzadik Kol Oven. There is a verse in Mishlei which says that no sin will befall the righteous. The righteous are protected from sin. He was relieved that he was protected from sin. Here we get a paragraph about cutting with a knife. It's a little bit different. One of the things that the Mishnah said was, it was talking about different things that you can or cannot buy from Gentiles. And one of them was a sliver of a fish called chiltis. It seems that the fish called chiltit was sold in like strings or slices. And in the case of the Mishnah here, the Mishnah had said, a slither of chiltis may not be eaten. Now, don't forget what I said about using the knife and whatever is based on Shulchan Aruch. This over here comes from the Gemora. It has to do with that time, the way in which these knives were used for different cooking purposes. And this Mishnah had said that when you buy this fish called chiltis from Gentiles, you have a problem if you buy a slither, a slice, because of other things that happen with that knife. And it'll explain what it is. But chiltis, chiltis, I think, is a kind of fish also. I think it's actually kosher, but the problem here is not that the fish. It's the way.
Here's the other part. Okay, I've got it. I'm blind.
Let's just see if we can. Meeting. There used to be a button that you can mute all and everyone unmutes, but from the early days of COVID, I remember that, but
Isn't it at the bottom of your screen? You should find it at the bottom. There's all those
at the bottom of the screen with all the
little gadgets.
I've got to find that again. Yeah, it used to be, they move things around on Zoom. They move stuff around, so I can't.
Whoever's not muted, mute yourself.
Yeah,
Mark.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Sorry,
Let's see what happens.
No, just now. I'm making these laws.
Okay, so Akurat shel chiltis, a slither of kiltis. My timer, what is the reason that the Mishnah doesn't want us to consume it? Mishum the mifsekalei besakina is because of the fact that the Gentiles slice the chiltis with a knife, and this knife is used for other things, and it could be non-kosher residue on the knife. However, even though that the master had said, a sage had already said, that when something gives off a tam lip gum, a detrimental taste or flavor, then its presence is permissible. In other words, we said that if there's a bit of residual not kosher flavor from something else, but it doesn't help, it doesn't enhance the dish that is now it's mixed into, it does the opposite. It's nice and tamli pagam. It gives a taste that's detrimental. It so-called ruins or deteriorates the culinary aspect of whatever is in it. The only time it's a problem if it's nice and tam l'shvach, if it lifts up or improves the situation. So why would that not be the case over here? So the Gemora explains, agav churfa de chiltasa, because of the sharpness of the chiltis. The chiltis was a very sharp fish. So what happens is, machalya lei shamnu nisa. It has a positive effect on the oil residue that's on the knife. It like lifts up its power as a flavorant, and then as a flavorant, it starts to do good things. So on its own, if it was another fish, it wouldn't do good things. But the chiltis, because it's a sharp fish, so what it does is it has a good reaction, at least from a culinary point of view, not a kashrut point of view. It has a good effect on the oily knife, and then the oily knife develops a flavor, and that flavor is imparted in a positive way to the chiltis, and that's the problem. It becomes a situation of giving improving flavor, but asur, and therefore prohibited. So that is the Gemora explaining why the Mishnah did not want us buying slices of chiltis from the Gentiles. In general, there's a discussion in Shulchan Aruch about when a knife is used in a situation like, for instance, what happens. It says in Shulchan Aruch, if a person takes a knife that was used to cut hot meat, you were carving a roast, and then afterwards, after cutting a wonderfully well-flavored piece of hot meat, somebody took the same knife and started dicing an onion. So there, a discussion takes place. There's two different opinions. One opinion is that it is a problem, in other words, to use that onion with milchiks, because now the knife with its meat gravy, when you cook meat, you get a wonderful gravy. I know when there's load shedding, I like to stick the meat on the Weber. Now, when it schwitzes in a pan over there, that's there's no gravy to match that. So how would you call it? The schwitz of the meat, of the roast that you're cutting with a knife, you put that in an onion, now you've got a real nice onion. You can't now use that onion with milchiks, according to most opinions, unless it says over there in Shulchan Aruch, if you want to, let's say you're very short of onions and now you need to use some onion for your dairy, for your breakfast, you have to cut away the thickness of a finger from where that knife was, with another knife, obviously a neutral knife, and get out at least a certain thickness that was cutting the knife with the fleischiks on it. Now, what's interesting is over there's two opinions. One opinion is that that's only the case if the knife was dirty. In other words, if the residue of the meat, the gravy was still on the knife, and it was within 24 hours. But if the knife was a clean knife and more than 24 hours old, then it doesn't matter if it's a fleishik knife. And certain halachic opinions actually took from this Gemora. I think one is quoted in the name of the Vilna Gaon, but certain halachic opinions took from this Gemara that it doesn't matter if the knife is clean. The principle is that because the chiltis, in this case the fish or the meat, is hot or whatever, that even if the knife was clean and even if the knife was older than 24 hours, we're still worried that the residue on the knife would have an effect on whatever it's cutting, and it can't be transferred meat to milk, and certainly not non-kosher to be thought of as kosher. And that comes from this Gemora. You know, we always say how halacha comes from this place. So where they quote that it doesn't matter if the knife is clean or not clean, they quote the Gemora in Avodah Zarah that talks about not buying slices of chiltis.
Is chiltit is a fish?
I think it's a fish.
Because according to
Let's-
Google,
let's-
chiltit is a spice.
Let's check. You could be right. I'm not going to argue with Google. Chiltis with Rabbi Google.
Yeah, no, I mean, chiltit is a northern,
The fish has a flavor, though. It has a very pungent flavor.
Can we borrow your Gemara? Let's see if it says this one.
I'm just checking in Shimon's Gemara here.
Discipline.
Asaf utida.
Reading glasses.
The spice.
I think you could be right. I think it is some form of spice. Unless it's a sharp fish like an anchovy.
Yeah, I was thinking anchovy sounds.
Because there's certain kinds of fish.
Because anchovy also is used as a flavor.
These are number 3 readers, right?
Yeah, is this number 3?
Yeah.
I actually have mine in the briefcase right here. That's 2. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Chiltis of Gentiles. But let's just check in the Mishnah all the way at what the Mishnah, what they translated.
Hiltus. This is
And a sliver of hiltit. B. This is asafoetida, a perennial herb from the Apicaceae family with thick roots and a stem with several branches, and it can grow up to. So you're absolutely right. It's a herb, not a fish. The sap is found in
very
the
strong, like onion.
yeah. It's used as a seasoning. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Shimon. Thanks, Ori. It's a very strong spice.
I wouldn't say thank God, but
Hmm?
Google it.
That's interesting because when they translate something with the Hebrew name, like let's say something's obvious, like nun is fish, they just put the English, but the English is calling it chiltis. It's not.
Doesn't call it patita.
Yeah, it doesn't say in the English translation.
name is patita.
Yeah, it doesn't say that over here. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
So they were
So words there,
the
but
Hebrew.
yeah, so they were saying to put the Hebrew. But what we do know is it's a sharp ingredient, and it's a herb. It's a powerful spice or herb. Yeah. You can think of something like strong. Yeah. Where we up to 923. Avdei de Rabbi Levi hakamazabin. Yeah, let's just do these 3 lines. Avdei de Rabbi Levi hakamazabin chiltisa. On the same subject. Rabbi Levi had a servant who would sell chiltis. He had a business. He sold chiltis. And it was permitted to buy it from him because he was the servant of a sage. In other words, you could trust him. Hinach nafsha de Rabbi Levi, when Rabbi Levi passed away, asala kama de Rabbi Yochanan, they came to Rabbi Yochanan with a question. Amrullah, they said, Ma'ola mizban minay. What is the halacha about continuing to buy chiltis from Rabbi Levi's servant? Because Rabbi Levi's not around anymore. You want to trust him because that's the guy that worked for him, but he's not around anymore. Amalahu, he said to them, Avdei shel chaver harehu kachaver. The servant of a chaver is like a chaver himself, is trusted like a chaver. Chaver literally means friend or member, but in this sense, it's used to mean one of the elite people that was meticulous about Torah values and halacha. Chaver meaning a colleague, actually. So, in other words, you would say that because the person is a colleague, and we mean in the sense that they a God-fearing person, cares about the laws of Tumah and Tara, cares about kashrus. So Rabbi Levi would obviously be considered a chaver, so people could go to his household and buy things. And as we just learned, because chiltis is sharp, and you don't know how it was cut and what happened with a knife, it could be tricky to buy it anywhere. But that's the kind of thing, but in his household, you could buy it. And even though it would seem his servant wasn't a Jewish fellow, but he had his little business, he was selling chiltis. People trusted him because he was Rabbi Levi's servant. What happened when Rabbi Levi died? They went to Rabbi Yochanan, what do we do? And he said, Avdei shel chaver kachaver. The trusted servant of a chaver is like a chaver himself. You can
Sure.
continue to trust him.
Oh,
Look at the notes here. It's
Yeah.
something very interesting. It says,
Yeah,
we'll be able to say that.
yeah,
It emerges from here that you're not allowed to buy this from, not only an idolater, you're not allowed to even buy it from an Amarit.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
not because,
Yeah, it depends what knife you got it.
Yeah.
Because if the knife was with meat or non-kosher meat or treif meat, then you can't get rid of it with the chishul.
But I think we'll stop over there, the formal side, and we'll continue next week.
Kosher.
you said no.
Pork.
Could you do that? No,
Oh, not kosher.
You can on
Right.
that.
No,
there would be a down
He's the wrong
You want
way.
That closes the formal share, Les. You can switch off the recording. Is he there?